with or no. So that's very nice, but also very happy to be meeting new people as well. I gather from discussions with Sarah that this may be not such a typical discussion to what you normally have. So, well, yeah, I'm just looking forward to hearing your perspective. So I'll share my screen and we'll crack on. Okay, so we're doing, it's always getting the little Zoom bar out of the way, isn't it? That's difficult. Oh, now probably do you see the notes and stuff as well, do you or not?
Yeah, we can see the main slide and the next slide.
The next slide. So how it's something to do with this, I think, isn't it? Is it just this? Yeah, is that it? Is that
Yeah,
changed?
perfect.
Yeah,
Well done.
great. Brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about delivering good lives for animals and thinking about the different people involved in that. Sarah was keen that I talk something about how this links in with animal resilience as well. So I'm going to bring in a bit of that, but a fair part of the start is going to be thinking a little bit about what it means to have a good life and sort of the biological basis of that. So we're going to start with that, then think about assessment, go on to resilience, and then the interaction with animal welfare and sustainability, and then that kind of final, I guess, more almost like a policy question about how we can all think about delivering that. And there is a little bit of interaction just via some Zoom polls at 2 or 3 points the way through. So yeah, feel free to vote or not vote. It's entirely up to you. So just to remind you, if you're less familiar with this concept of a good life, it's an interesting word, isn't it? Because it has this kind of almost like a moral and ethical dimension to it in kind of normal parlance, as well as this kind of sense of good being, just having a good life. So in 2009, the Farm Animal Welfare Council produced this report and encapsulated this conference, and it was very forward thinking and really sought to bring in those positive emotions and positive aspects to animals, because prior to that we'd been really focused on things like the 5 freedoms and so on, which were around getting away from all of those negatives. So sometimes I quite like to kind of remind myself about what they thought then in terms of looking at this diagram. So you're probably familiar with this concept of a life not worth living, kind of being kind of below a red line, let's say, and then a life worth living, and then onto the good life. But they also divided it up in terms of these, what it actually meant. So a life worth living, they considered socially acceptable quality of life, for example, and then life not worth living, sort of socially unacceptable. And then they've suggested that the policy around that is that you've got that minimum legal standard should be set where an animal should have a life worth living. So we shouldn't be keeping any animals that we honestly think would be better off being dead than in the current status. That's an interesting discussion in itself. And there hasn't been major legislative change, for example, since they wrote this report in terms of, some of the most kind of confining systems. Then you're thinking about this balance of good and poor welfare. So again, this kind of, positives outweighing the negatives, and then really going like much more to the positives in the good life. And this is encapsulating this idea of kind of these wants and needs. So in the good life, you've got all your basic needs met, and then you're able to kind of flourish with these extra wants. So the things that actually kind of make life fun and enjoyable, and so on. So the government at that time said that the report said that government should set strategic goals in farm animal welfare to ensure that every farm animal has a life worth living, and that a growing number of farm animals have a good life. So that was also quite interesting, that it was about this growing and sort of continuous improvement, and that meant that they should have provision of opportunities in this sort of higher level for comfort, pleasure, interest, and confidence. So those were the kind of 4 categories that they or domains that they thought went into a good life. And they considered that an opportunity that would be considered to contribute to a good life would be a resource that an animal does not need for biological fitness, but is valued. So in other words, it's used by the animal. So the animal could survive without it, but the very fact that it's choosing to use it is suggesting that it has some value to it, and therefore it's delivering something of a good life. And just to kind of come back to this whole thing about what is welfare. So there's, obviously, as you might imagine, endless discussions and debates, but essentially for some time now, there's been this sort of model of there being kind of 3 elements to it. So first of all, kind of the basic health and functioning, how biologically fit is the animal. Secondly, how natural is it? So in terms of the body, but also performing natural behaviours. And then thirdly, how does the animal feel? What is its affective state? And we know from lots of research that different groups of people place different weights on these various things. So citizens tend to place much higher weight on the natural living, for example, than either farmers or scientists. Standard farmers tend to major on the basic health and functioning, although there's some evidence that organic farmers actually gravitate more towards the other 2 than standard farmers do. And then animal welfare scientists tend to plump down quite heavily on this affective state model, kind of how does the animal feel. So this is our chance to have a little think where you might sit on these. So I'm going to give you 4 scenarios for Sally the cow. We're going to vote on each of them in turn. So Sally is a female cow living on the Tillingham estate. She lives in a group with 10 other cows and often interacts with them. She spends most of her days roaming the estate, grazing the huge variety of foods present. She is in good physical health. She's had many healthy offspring. Some of them live with her still. And along with her food, Sally eats these astrosa leaves. You may not have heard of them, but never mind. These leaves serve as a natural stimulant and they promote mental health. And an amazing team of neuropsychologists and cattle experts using state-of-the-art technology has recently determined that Sally spends almost all of her time feeling excellent. So if Sarah can launch the first Zoom poll, perhaps we could vote on how you rate her quality of life from 1 extremely bad to 7 extremely good. And I see that I can't vote, but not to worry. It's not a trick question. You can vote however you like. Okay, Sarah, I think people finished voting? Seems like it, roughly. Give you another 5 seconds.
I'm not seeing anything live at my end. It
Oh,
said
I
it
am.
launched.
I'm seeing it.
I'm hoping people can see it.
Maybe I can end the poll and maybe it'll come up then. Shall I try that?
I can see it, and I think I'm a co-host as well. So do you want me to?
Yes.
Can you see the results, Siobhan?
I can see the results, yes.
Okay.
Shall I end the poll? And share results? Are people seeing the results now?
Yeah.
Can you see them, Pen? Because I'm a co-host, so I think
Yeah,
I'm
no,
seeing
we can see them now.
everything.
They've just come
Brilliant.
out. Yeah, we can see
Okay,
them.
brilliant. So most people are putting extremely good. If not, then level 6 and 1 person down to level 5. So onto the next permutation of this. So very, very similar. I won't read out all the first part because that's all the same. But what you should note is that despite all of this and despite eating these astrosa leaves, Sally's living everything else exactly the same, but their state-of-the-art technology has recently determined that Sally spends almost all of her time feeling terrible. So now I'd like you to vote on what you think her quality of life is.
I still think we've got question 1 up. I don't know on the poll.
I don't see any.
I can't see the new poll.
Okay, I think maybe Sarah
Sarah,
might
can
have to
you-
relaunch.
Yeah, I think you'll have to launch number 2.
Don't panic, guys. I am in the process of relaunching. I'm hoping that's done it.
Okay, I see that.
Yeah, we've got
Perfect.
it now.
Yeah, brilliant. So already some people have started voting. Great. Last few votes are coming in now. We nearly reached the same number that we had before. Just give you another few seconds and I will end the poll now. And I'll share the results. So hopefully those have come up. Do you see them yet?
They came up and then they vanished again for me.
Ah, okay, let me try sharing.
Yeah.
Again, are they there?
Well, flipped on and off. There, they're back.
They're back. Okay, great. Okay, so as possibly we might expect, everybody's moved their scores down a bit. So 4 is most common now, so dead kind of plump in the middle, and a couple of people for 5 and for 2 and for 3 as well. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and I could have stopped it there, but I'm going to press on with another scenario for Sally. So she now is living in a research facility. She lives on her own, apart from any other cattle, and she seldom interacts with her caretakers. She spends most of her day in her indoor pen. She's in poor physical health. She's given a dose of psychoactive drugs every day, which serve as an artificial stimulant that promote mental health. But unfortunately for Sally, nonetheless, this team has recently determined that Sally spends almost all of her time feeling terrible. So Sarah, can we have another poll? Great. So go for it with Sally. Okay, everyone's voting really quickly now. So I will end the poll and share the results. So do you see them? Probably unexpectedly, most people are scoring as really extremely bad or just slightly off that in terms of her quality of life. I'm going to stop sharing. We've got the final kind of permutation of this, in that now this psychoactive drugs seem to be working really well, and Sally spends almost all of her time feeling excellent despite being in the same conditions as before in the research facility. So Sarah, can you launch the final poll? Great, thanks. And just about everybody seems to have voted now. So last couple of people, if you want to vote. Brilliant. I will end the poll and share the results. So really interesting results. I'm not going to say perhaps too much more about them, but maybe we can discuss this in the end. But I will just say that I've kind of adapted this scenario from one that is published in the literature. And the results were very similar, actually. In fact, they had done it for a chimpanzee. But the results are very similar. And of course, it's teasing out where people's weight is going in terms of kind of affective state, how you're feeling, but then the sort of living setting and then the physicalness as well. Okay, so moving on now to positive experiences, and there's some really important things just to kind of remind ourselves about, that they involve a conscious element, and there's lots of ways we can talk about them, but emotions or feelings are kind of central to them, and often just used as a way of describing them. And if you have sufficient number, particularly over a longer period of time, then these positive experiences can lead to a more generalized good mood. So experiences can be quite short term, but mood is generally talked about over a longer period of time. So here's some different types of things. So we're looking at companionship, even sort of interspecies companionship, humans and pigs, or sheep and goats. Various forms of behaviours that pigs enjoy, like wallowing and being with the piglets and so on. And then we've got obviously a natural group of chickens foraging in the long grass. And this is a quote from one of the kind of foremost human researchers of positive emotions, and they say that in a sense, pleasure can be thought of as evolution's boldest trick, serving to motivate an individual to pursue rewards necessary for fitness. So I think it's really important to remind ourselves that there is this kind of very strong evolutionary drive that comes with positive emotions, not dissimilar to the negative drives as well. So I'm sure all kind of familiar with this idea that wolves or puppies are playing kind of to prepare themselves for future life. In this case it would be hunting, but in the case of our lambs it might be about getting away from predators and kind of developing physical strength and so on. But we've got this kind of flip side just to kind of always remember. So in our human but also animal sense, in modern environments of abundance, it can also motivate people to induce maladaptive pursuits such as addictions. So the environment is there interacting with this kind of evolutionary drive, and not always to the good. So just to take you a little bit to the kind of mechanics of it, I suppose, there's these three components of reward, and they all interact together, feed back on each other, and play different roles in this. So first of all, you've got this wanting part, so where you've had this kind of positive anticipation and a motivation, and that'll take animals towards places that they think will be more rewarding, and in humans kind of puts them in situations where they think they'd be likely to achieve some kind of reward. And then you've got what's known as this core hedonic experience. So this is the bit that you can disentangle these three things within human kind of psychology and MRI studies and so on. And this is the bit that people essentially say is pleasurable. So interestingly, that positive anticipation is not always and not necessarily pleasurable. And you can sort of think maybe of the sort of the addict or somebody who's kind of driven to go and seek this, and a lot of the experiments have been done on addicts of various kinds, gambling or drug addicts, and they always describe that this kind of seeking the hedonic experience is actually not very rewarding at all. And then you have these positive associations, so you can get this feedback loop through learning that things can be pleasurable, but it's really that middle bit, that sort of liking, that's most important. And so subjective reward experiences may be partly synthesized from motivation and cognitive appraisal components. So everything comes together, and it's exactly in line with other emotions. I really want to get that across to you, that there's sort of nothing special or different about positive emotions. It's just that we haven't really focused so much on them in the animal world. And I really like this kind of idea that even across species and across different ages of animals, there's this very kind of innate response to either a sweet taste in this case or a bitter taste, but they call it these liking and disgust reactions. So across rats, primates and human babies, we have this same response, but even totally sort of neonatal babies show this response. So it's all kind of hot wired in already, perhaps by the time we're born, and most likely in all mammals as well. And it's also important to remember that maybe it doesn't really matter what the different stimuli are. It all kind of funnels together in that same opioid mediated hedonic reaction. So whether it's in the case of humans, you know, friends and family, art experiences, music, and so on, food, pleasures, and other things, it's all mediated in that same way, and that's exactly the same for the animals as well. So let's think about what sort of things influence positive experiences, and we are going to draw a little bit on the human literature as well. So, well, William Cooper suggests that happiness depends, as nature shows, less on exterior things than most suppose. And despite the time when he wrote this, it turns out he wasn't so wrong. So looking at twin studies, about 50% of the variance of quality of life ratings is heritable. So that's quite high for you know, for heritability. And personality type is really important in explaining that. So extroverts tend to generally report higher quality of life scores, and people who score highly on the neurotic scale out of the big five tend to report lower quality of life scores. But of course, there is, you know, that individual variation as well. So studies have shown that people who are what's called high sensation seekers are much more satisfied when they've had a day of, you know, high sensation. So in this case, bungee jumping or whatever. And people who are low sense seekers, they report they've had a much better day when they are sort of nice and content. So the same is likely true for our animals as well, that we've got that individual variation within our animals. We could think about selectively breeding for pleasure. I just want to show you this video, which if you haven't seen these rats being tickled, it's quite something. And this is something that's going on in many laboratories now across the UK and many other countries. Once they started to realize that rats really enjoy rough and tumble play, effectively it can be mimicked by humans, and they emit this, it's called laughing, but it's essentially this 50 kilohertz sound, which you won't hear, but I'm just going to show you. So that's a rat being tickled, and it really enjoys it. And they especially really enjoy that flipping action of being kind of tumbled onto their back. That seems to be something that's quite important to them in that play, the play that they enjoy. And they have been for some time now breeding, experimentally seeing whether they could breed rats. So keep selecting them on those rats that seem to produce more of these sort of laughing calls, and those rats apparently appear to experience more pleasure. They've sort of cross-validated that. So they've got these two lines of kind of high pleasure, if you like, high fun rats, and then the sort of low pleasure rats. And what they found is that over time, these two lines essentially have sort of changed the way that they play. So maybe not, perhaps not so important, but possibly mimics that idea of the high sensation, low sensation seekers, that we're sort of getting that divergence. And then possibly more of interest, they've got a different response to a threat, in this case, the odor of a cat. So the sorry, I'm just going to go back. The high 50 kilohertz rats spend more time hiding away from the cat, or the cat odor in this case, than the ones from the low line. So possibly that's you know, environmentally protective, but it could also be detrimental if they're actually hiding away too much and not going on to search for food. But either way, it would have an evolutionary impact, or a sort of biological fitness impact, let's say. And of course, as we all know, we've had this kind of previous focus on these negative states in animals, so pain, frustration, and so on. This is nothing new to you. And I guess the positive animal welfare kind of brings something different. And so when we start to think about what that means for farm animals, maybe we need to think about, how do we know what they might want? So we've got these observations of behavior, what we're seeing all the time on farms, but also in, of course, in laboratory experiments as well, what those animals are choosing to do. There are some specific indicators of pleasure, but not many, it has to be said, and certainly not as many as the sort of negative indicators. And we do think about some of the fundamental research, but that tends to be pretty limited. And then we might also use extrapolation from maybe the principles of human experiences, which is why I've brought in some of that information to you already. So these experiences we just heard, but I'm going to say that they are going to be one of the ways that we think about finding out what animals want might be preference tests. So this is an example of one that was done at the University of Bristol by Christine Nicol, and it's kind of a very typical T-maze. The chicken's put in the middle, and then she can walk either side to decide which side she likes, and then each side will have something different about it. It might be the bedding, it might be the food, it might be the space, it might be the presence of another chicken, whatever. And one of the things that's come out is that individuals are often quite consistent in the choices that they make, but it may not be the same as another chicken. So they might be sort of consistently different to their another one of the chickens in the experiment. And we always, of course, have to remember that we're only offering them the choices that we offer, as it were, and so that's the limitation of the study. And they might just be choosing the lesser of two evils. Nevertheless, we've learned a huge amount from preference tests, not least by sort of pitting different types of preferences, especially things that we either know or seriously imagine that animals might really like, you know, favorite foods and things like this, against other choices. So this is an example of a preference test. Just need to move my bar a second, where cows were offered the chance to go outside to pasture. This is dairy cows, and they have this increasingly weighted gait that they need to push to get there. Just really trying. This is like maximum weightedness, let's say. They just about squeeze out. And I really like that video. It illustrates really nicely the results from this paper, which says that dairy cows value access to pasture as highly as to fresh feed, and they particularly valued it in the evening times. But I think it serves as a great illustration to anybody about the strength of the motivation, clearly, for those cows to get out. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to go on. So just remembering that these positive experiences, as we talked about, might be quite short term, or they might lead to a more generalized mood, but we also need to set that in the context of a good life across the whole length of life of the animal as well, and thinking about how each of those kind of fits in amongst probably some other negative experiences, or certainly some less pleasurable times as well. And here's some human researchers again, who they suggest that overall well-being is not simply a lack of negative states, but may predominantly depend upon positive experiences. And that's from the results from human studies. So I'm going to ask you now, I'm not going to ask you to vote on this, you can just think this to yourself. Which face comes closest to expressing how you feel about your life as a whole? Just give you 5 seconds to think which one you relate to for your life as a whole. And then I'll show you the results. These results are incredibly replicable across all sorts of countries, cultures. It's been repeated so many times, and this is the general distribution of what you get for humans when you ask them to reflect on their life as a whole. So quite positive, which is good. Not everyone's wildly enthusiastic, but everyone's pretty content, I would say, and just very few are in the sort of even neutral to negative level. But I have got a question to ask you about this, which is, how did you decide? When you thought about which face you were, did you just have a kind of general sense of a feeling, or did you think about very specific events or circumstances? So Sarah, if you could launch that poll, please. Brilliant, thank you. Great, thanks. I think that's probably most people have voted now. So I'm going to end the poll and then I will share the results with you. So as you can see, we've got a really strong group of people mostly considering an overall feeling, and then just a couple are thinking about kind of very specific events or circumstances. And that leads us to sort of thinking ourselves about how we're going to assess the lives of an animal, because it's really hard for us to tap into that overall feeling, and it's much easier for us to think about possibly specific life events. Okay, so these thinking about this kind of weighing up the negative versus positive contribution to overall welfare state, it's really important to remember that pain is a really important component of welfare, and certainly in humans, kind of pain or severe depression are possibly the exceptions to that rule about people thinking about their predominantly being driven by positive experiences. But we do know that pain can be ameliorated by positive experiences, and so there is a role to play, even when animals are in theory in a kind of quite negative state with pain. But on the flip side of that, we also know that pain or depression can reduce the ability to experience pleasures. So that's both in humans and non-human animal experiments across lots of different species. So you just seem to be kind of down-regulated in terms of being able to enjoy life. So in terms of people may experience abundant well-being when they feel many pleasant and few unpleasant emotions, engage in interesting activities, many pleasures and few pains, and when they're satisfied with their lives. And having that purpose or sort of satisfaction with their lives is quite important. And then the thing that I always try and remember, I'm not sure that there's really evidence of this in animals, but in humans, time spent in the positive state is a much better predictor of well-being than intensity of those positive states. So it kind of, I guess it's logical in one sense, but I think for us thinking about animals, it is important to think about what happens every single day, rather than these few isolated occurrences of either positive or negative things. And one of the ways that we can maybe bring together some of these things that we've been learning about animals is that by offering them meaningful choices, we are, at least positive choices anyway, we're likely to increase their positive emotions. So they might obviously enjoy the things that we're offering, but we also know that you get additional pleasure from things that are pleasurable if you choose it, and that's the same for people and animals. And of course we've got that opportunity then to think of the, you know, the chickens that are preferring one thing versus their friends that are preferring something else. You've got the different and it might also modulate what's termed this hedonic adaptation, which is where, you know, you win the lottery and 2 years later you're just as miserable as you ever were. And I think it is about 2 years for lottery winners. It's also about 2 years if you move into a new house or do serious renovations, that you get that kind of honeymoon effect. And one thing that there's a few studies coming, they're all lab based at the moment, but that there's very strong evidence that animals choose to choose. So in usually primates in quite horrible sort of psychology settings, for example, prefer to choose the order that they're going to do tasks and things like this, or have control over their environment as well, turning lights on and off and this type of thing. So I'm just going to come on to some practical frameworks now that I've been working on with Jess Stokes and David Main at the RAU, and Lizzie Rowe, who I think is on the call as well. And all of them been very sort of instrumental in driving forward the development of positive welfare frameworks. So just to remind you about these good life concept again, and these 4 elements that Falk recommended: comfort, pleasure, interest, and confidence. And then we actually added on this next one, which is a healthy life, because we felt that it needed it in the sort of practical context. We couldn't have anything that was going to be sort of contrary to leading a healthy life. So at the moment we've got published in the literature frameworks for these 6 animals, farmed animals, and the focus is very much on this provision of choice. And we've got sort of 3 levels of positive welfare, if you like, above the existing legislation and codes of practice. We started, when we made these, from the very top, where we kind of said, okay, what is level 3, which is basically farmed animal utopia? The only sort of restriction we had was that we said we were going to take the product from the animal, whatever it is, whether it's some meat or, you know, milk or whatever. That's kind of a given that we're going to take the product, but everything else, it doesn't have to be economic, it doesn't have to be, you know, currently practical or whatever. And then we sort of just worked back from there and in kind of measurable increments, as I say, focusing on choice. Jess ran quite substantial trials and sort of shaping of the framework with sheep and dairy farmers initially, and then Lizzie did something similar with broiler, beef and pig farmers. And here's an example of kind of what it's like in practice. So this is the sheep one, and this is for the tier that is interested by a positively enriched environment. So you can see we've got these 3 levels up. Everything underlined is actually things that farmers wanted to add in. So in this case, it was mostly examples of different types of enrichments that they use. And then essentially, Welfare Plus is about providing some enrichment in both animals that are housed and outdoor animals, and then provided continuously, and then finally for the next level, providing continuously and change frequently, and the farmer monitors the use of resources as well to see what it is that they actually like. So each one of the species has got kind of several of these, around, I don't know, 12 to 15, let's say, for each species. And farmers we had a real mix of farmers, and actually they were quite positive about it. And interestingly, this aspect of pride kind of came out really strongly as something that was really driving them in wanting to promote positive welfare, but also these other aspects as well. And in terms of thinking about animals and resilience, we always have this kind of, it's like a pat phrase, isn't it? Like, oh, of course, you know, happy animals are going to be more resilient and so on. But, you know, there's a bit more kind of nuance perhaps to it. When we think about resilience, we're thinking about the capacity of animals to cope with short-term challenges and return quickly to their pre-challenge status, regain healthy functioning in the face of disturbances. And that might be, you know, handling requirements, it might be disease, it might be environmental challenge, whatever. And there's a couple of different coping styles that are often kind of reported. This is just a schematic. And in fact, both coping styles are kind of needed and probably used in each animal, but they work sort of slightly differently. So you've got this passive coping style where you might sort of not almost barely notice the challenge, whether that's a disease or whether it's in this case for this schematic disease, but it could be kind of, you're just very kind of laid back and it doesn't really challenge you very much. And that leads to disease resilience. But then we've got this other aspect where you get the disease, you have maybe some learning around it, how to avoid that in the future. Your immune system adapts and so on, and you develop disease resistance and disease tolerance. And we know that good animal welfare improves cognition, learning, and immune function, and all of those things are likely to improve disease resistance and tolerance. But there is this kind of caveat, I suppose, that there's this idea of this stress inoculation. So some challenge is helpful. You can see that pathway kind of requires it to develop that resistance and tolerance. So it's a fine line to balance how to manage that challenge, I suppose. And then breeding for resilience is really focused on actually both levels. And there's actually quite a lot of work going on at the moment looking at breeding for resilience. I mean, just as an example, we've seen that kind of the reverse has happened in terms of low back fat pigs and sheep have got poorer disease resistance. So now there's trying to kind of redress that balance and go back again. But I think that we haven't really got there yet in terms of thinking really about what resilience is and therefore what we want to select and what implications that might have for productivity and other characteristics, including welfare. So we've got this, I guess what I think of this kind of challenge sometimes bringing together animal welfare and sustainability. So we know that both those things are really highly valued by citizens, and sometimes they align, which is great, and sometimes they're in conflict. So the things that align are like really simple, controlling disease, mortality. You've got healthy, happier, productive animals. There's an absolute win-win. Like no argument for that. Vets are at the centre of this. Farmers, obviously, as well. This is absolutely bread and butter for them. So yeah, no dispute about that. But then we've got this other issue where sometimes animal welfare and climate concerns may conflict, and that I think is especially true for system change, where you've got really high welfare benefits. So really properly getting out of intensive systems and so on. And there may be some ethical trade-off. It's not the only way that this may be approached, but I guess I'm sure, like and probably all citizens would say this, we must have all animals above some sort of red line. It's just that maybe all of our red lines are a little bit in a different place. But I'm interested to know from you in the final little poll before we haven't got too much longer to go before we can chat about it all. How do you rank some of these concerns? So Sarah, if you could launch the poll, I'm going to ask you to rank net zero, biodiversity, and animal welfare. Not easy, is it? So people are starting to vote, but I can see there's a little bit of time to think about how to manage it. And I have been a little bit mean by forcing you to rank them in an order. Okay, I'll just give you another few seconds just to quickly get the last few votes in, but I can see that almost everybody has voted now, which is great. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. Oop. Okay, so first, okay, interesting. So if I'm reading, so animal welfare gets the highest number of first places, just marginally behind is biodiversity and net zero. But interestingly, I'm really surprised at this, that the net zero gets the highest number of third places. So I'm very interested to have this discussion then after we finish. Let's just stop sharing now. Okay. So just thinking about you know, starting to come from your perspective now, I was and working with Sarah, which is great, you know, to really think about how regenerative agriculture fits into the whole well, I guess into that whole mix of animal welfare, biodiversity and net zero concerns. This quite nice review paper had a look, and they essentially came to the conclusion that the papers that they found when they did this review basically linked animal welfare to animal health. So they didn't think beyond that. So think about our three aspects of animal welfare. They basically linked human welfare to farm finances and farmer self-awareness, and then environmental conservation they linked to soil improvement. And they concluded that basically the information at the moment is insufficient to determine how regenerative agriculture impacts on animal welfare. And they strongly suggest that there's a need to research this, which is where Sarah comes in, so that's great, and PFL supporting that. So I think it's really, you know, I know I'm sort of preaching to the converted here that we need to be evidence-based in everything that we do. And of course, we're integrating animal welfare science into other disciplines. I'm just going to give you an example now of broiler chickens. So we've got obviously the standard bird in a shed there, probably, well, 38 kilograms per meter squared, maybe 30,000 of them. They've got natural lights. It's probably in the UK or Europe. And then the European chicken commitment. So we've got slower growing breed and a lower stocking density and a few more enrichments as well. So a report in 2018 suggested that to go from the standard to the chicken commitment would roughly increase cost by about 20% and roughly greenhouse gases a little bit more. But very interestingly, North Shilling kind of, which is a huge Norwegian chicken company, they produce a third of all the chickens in Norway and retail through one major supermarket. They just went kind of full for it in terms of switching over to European chicken commitment. And they have found that across their whole supply chain, I should say, a business, and they are an integrated business, they've actually reduced their greenhouse gas emissions by 28%. It's not quite a shed for shed comparison, but they haven't seen the dramatic reductions that we thought, or dramatic increases we thought before. And far from the cost being prohibitive, they've actually found that it's equally profitable within just 3 years. They always knew they'd have a transition time. And they've been a really interesting case study when you start bringing in kind of other aspects that aren't easily thought about or calculated in a sort of simple back of the envelope stuff. Actually, in the real world, humans are quite good at finding solutions, and once you commit to something, you find that you can do it a bit better. So that gives me a bit of hope for not just chickens, but for lots of ways that we might need to tackle net zero and incorporate higher, let's call it, welfare standards along with that. Oh, sorry, let me go back quickly. So one of the things that is probably a potential win-win is enrichments, because most of them probably have either minimal negative environment impact, and some of them, like the Soil Association advert for herbal leys, could actually be positive for biodiversity, particularly if it's natural tree planting and so on. And we just should note perhaps that some tools are not very suitable for possibly niche high welfare systems, so calf contact dairy. And Jess Stokes, who I mentioned early, and I have got a project now with working with European partners, and one of the things that we're going to do is build a specific calculator for cow-calf dairy systems. So we've got these different actors in the chain, thinking about how we can all play our part for animals. I'm just going to go through them kind of in turn relatively quickly, and we can discuss them. So farmers, I guess it's the kind of, you know, there's obvious things about just trying new things, thinking outside the box, and I guess being part of a movement to shift the norms, discussing with other farmers, and really importantly, sort of that innovative farmers type approach of actually doing some kind of monitoring of what you're doing. Vets and advisors, well, they do need an underpinning knowledge of animal behaviour and welfare, I think, and that's something that has been quite lacking within the vet course, and certainly I've learned a huge amount since, you know, since kind of becoming more interested in this. I think, you know, this holistic planning to health and welfare planning, so bringing in the behavioural stuff to health and welfare plans, will help to upskill vets, and then, you know, encourage that conversation with farmers. And of course they go around lots of farms, so they have that opportunity to share experiences and good practices. Farm assurance schemes would be great if they included assessments, even on a sample of farms, and then even potentially publish their findings. So just as an example, you know, some things might be required by the schemes. We did a study of hen farms which were either Soil Association or RSPCA assured, but we found that 28% of those farmers were going above and beyond the scheme requirements in providing good life things. And at the moment, they're getting no recognition for that. Nobody knows about it. There's just stuff that they're doing. It's, you know, it doesn't feature anywhere, and unless you look for it, you know, the schemes or anybody else wouldn't know. And of course, you can have, you know, champions and success stories and so on. And then government, I'm just going to talk briefly about a payment scheme that I was involved in, a project which was to evaluate the payments for animal welfare. So you'll remember that the animal health and welfare pathway has these kind of 3 elements. So health and welfare enhancements, stimulating market demand, and strengthening the regulatory baseline. Well, yeah, whether that's legislation change or just improving compliance, we've kind of yet to see. So we had I guess these kind of, you know, this is what they say, there's these different aspects, some of which were all starting to come in. So this is the bit that I was involved in, payment by results, and they are on to now trialing some of these things. And I know that some of the people on the call were also involved in the early stages of the project as well, which was great. So we essentially kind of came up with a list of what they called welfare enhancements, things that government could pay for. We went out to farms who were already doing or using those, whether it was inputs or outcomes, and worked out the cost benefit of those, and then asked farmers what their views were. And essentially we've given this cost benefit tool to DEFRA now to inform their decisions. So these enhancements were something government could pay for, a mixture of inputs, risk factors for negative welfare and positive welfare things as well, or they were outcomes, so mostly negative, but could be, you know, dairy cow lameness, feather loss in chickens, whatever. We collected this huge amount of data from farmers, and that included like the costs and also the economic benefits of using these enhancements, and then also the outcomes that were derived from it. And I guess what we tended to find was that items with a low cost unsurprisingly ranked highly in a cost effectiveness exercise, but that did include enrichments. And I think that's really positive, and especially as enrichments can be used in pretty much any, you know, type of system. But high cost things really did go down, and that was often things like system change stuff. So for example, providing indoor-outdoor choice for dairy cows. Experts scored it as giving really high welfare points, but actually it was, you know, it's just really costly to do. And then in terms of the outcomes, really interestingly to us, we had sort of all those negative outcomes, but also we included the 4 positive welfare outcomes that I mentioned earlier, and one of them was one of them was always first, and it was usually pleasure in terms of what would be most cost effective to provide for animals. And some of those really difficult outcomes came down essentially, you know, it's if we knew how to solve dairy cow lameness, we'd have done it already, and so we know that it's quite difficult. So just to finish then, and to summarize, yeah, these positive experiences are really essential, and there are frameworks that are there that can be used to try and assess those higher welfare provisions on farms in the UK, and everyone can play their part, I suppose. And maybe in some ways the most interesting part is this new payment landscape that might offer scope to drive change. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, Siobhan. Thank you so much. Wow, a lot there. And you managed to fit it into to under an hour. I'm really impressed. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and all of the links. I was furiously writing down and trying to copy and paste some information about those papers so that I can go away and have a look at them afterwards. I'm going to open up for questions. I've got a couple. I'm going to take chair's prerogative, so I'm sorry about that. The first one, I guess, was a comment and then a question. So the comment being, it was interesting about the company that made the commitment with the the European chicken commitment, that it kind of shows that sometimes the models and the reality don't always align. So here was a model that said it would be more expensive, greater emissions, and fair play to them for just cracking on and doing it. Sorry, that's a terrible pun, isn't it? Relating to chickens and eggs, but and that actually they found the reality was quite different. So that's continues to add grist to the mill, as it were, in terms of beware of models, which I know most modelers are aware of the challenges, but unfortunately it feels like sometimes policymakers just take them as truth. So that was one thing. And the other thing I was really interested in was and you kept adding bits to the slide, so I kept having to take new photos of it, which I hope you don't mind, but was that thing about the Colditz and Hine paper or research. And I was really interested in that because I think it was delivered in relation to disease. But actually, for many of us within pasture for life systems, we're always thinking about selection pressure, so that we can, and adding in challenge to our animals, so that we can enable them to thrive off really low input systems. Because the genetic base, particularly for, let's say, new entrants who are buying new animals or farms that are going through a period of transition, the genetic base is one that has got used to inputs. And so there's a I guess a trade-off between pushing animals to a state that is applying the level of challenge to them that you're going to need to know that they can thrive, but finding that balance and that fine line between challenge, epigenetic development, which we all need within our herds and flocks, health and welfare. So I'd be really interested just if you've got any thoughts on that at all.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and you're exactly right. That model applies whether it's disease or some other type of resilience that you're looking for. I mean, we know that, for example, overcoming a challenge is one of the most pleasurable things for humans and animals. But there are different types of challenges that you might be involved in. So that could be like, you know, food seeking and then eventually finding something. So you could obviously challenge your animals in that way. But other types of challenges, like, I don't know, being able to survive at colder temperatures, or, you know, something like this might be a different type of thing. So then you've got that kind of yeah, you've still got to do the shepherding role of you know, how far can we take them? But I'm sure, I mean, you know, you've only got to think of the people who swim across the channel. It's like sleeping under a sheet with their windows open, you know, like, you know, it is amazing what you can put yourself through gradually.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Pen, you've got your hand up.
Well, it was sort of following on from that, and from what Siobhan was saying, in terms of the difference between an acute sort of stressor and a chronic stressor. And if you can introduce it gradually and have it short term, then when you overcome it, it's pleasurable to some extent, except unless you get that fear response in an animal. But if you've got this chronic wear you down, you know, that sore belly that continually never goes away, better way of putting it, and so I know it's associated with health, but that sort of feeling that or feeling of depression that doesn't go away, that chronic depression, that long-lasting thing, then that may, you know, and you get kind of resigned to it in a way, but you're not really happy. I guess that's what your early sort of questions that you were giving us was kind of coming into that to some extent when you were talking about, you know, the neuroscientists might have worked out how to monitor that. But what's your feeling on that?
On the level of challenge.
On the
I mean,
level of challenge, but also the acuteness of chronicness, and maybe then moving also to early learning as well, and sort of building resilience.
yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge amount that we can
Yeah.
do, which we're currently not doing within, you know, most existing systems. And exactly as you've talked about the early learning, you know, the social learning that goes on between generations, which, you know, I know will be really important to many of you on your farms, and which is lost on, you know, so many types of farms that we have. So I think that if we lined up everything that could go together and support resilience, like there would be a huge amount already that we could sort of tap into, I suppose. I suppose the only way to really think whether you're challenging animals too far is to just keep monitoring them, which again, you know, is obviously just what, you know, what farmers would be doing kind of on a day-to-day basis. But I don't think we have the answers as to like how far we can push animals in. It's certainly not in, you know, lots of different circumstances that we might be concerned about.
Okay, I'm going to move on to Bill. I think Pen put a hand back up, but maybe you're right to come in a bit, Pen. Go on, Bill. Okay, let's go for Bill.
Yes, thanks, Vicky. Just really interesting perspective. Sure. And the thing that got me most focused was having to rank these different objectives. And when push comes to shove for us, for me anyway, I would put biodiversity ahead of animal welfare. And I would justify that on the basis that in a more naturalistic system, then the animals themselves would be having to look after their own interests in a world that wasn't necessarily best suited to delivering their welfare. And as Nikki just said, you know, we're trying to get assemble groups of animals that are probably better equipped to deal with those sort of challenges than the ones that would be coming out of conventional farming systems. So you know, that we have to face up to the reality that we are putting them in situations where they won't necessarily feel that they're living a good life if we could ever know what they felt about it. But I would be quite confident that I could demonstrate that in doing that, we have, over the years we've been managing these kinds of systems, we have produced a group of animals. You know, it's sort of largely a closed herd where we just keep the ones that perform best to provide the next generation. And I remember when we started, we had a group of novice animals, some of whom had been bucket reared as dairy calves. So that's pretty well the worst possible starting point if you're just going to chuck them out into some very scrubby, rough grazing situation. And I remember they did struggle, but over the years it's quite clear to me that they have changed, and now they actually go and choose to tackle some of that kind of vegetation when they also have access to some much more nutritious looking stuff. So, you know, just our starting point may not be very encouraging, but, you know, we have to have this eye on where we're trying to get to and be prepared maybe to stand our ground and say that what we're doing does have a justification if we can demonstrate that it will produce the changes in the animals to allow them to cope better, to be more resilient.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds really interesting and a great example, definitely. And I'm sure, I'm guessing that you said, even though you know, you've kind of, you know, put animal welfare down a bit compared to biodiversity, because you expect that in the end animal welfare will follow, that whilst you've had that transition on the farm, you've put in place protections for those animals, you know, so you haven't let the animal welfare, you know, you've kept it boundaried, let's say, whilst they've had to learn how to forage on different foods and what have you.
Yeah, so if an animal is not coping, then we have the means to take them away
Yeah.
and bring and you know, usually what happens is an animal looks as though it's struggling to maintain condition.
Yeah.
And then what we can do is just not put them back into the breeding cycle. And after a year or so of just, you know, scuffing around and just maintaining themselves, they recover condition. And then they, if we think they're worth it, they can go on and have another go. But
Mhm.
it's, you know, we do have some flexibility that allows us to cope with that.
Mhm. Yeah.
I'm going to come to Ian next, but I'm just very minded that Bill, it's really interesting that, so Bill and I were up to the point where the animal is taken out the breeding group. Bill would let them recover until they're at the right body condition. Ours would go on the cull list. And that becomes that point of, you know, ultimately the animals are there to produce food. Also for Bill and I, and both of our systems are there to deliver a biodiversity benefit because of the way that we run our businesses. It's really interesting at that, you know, you talk about welfare, but ultimately there's a point about taking an animal out of the system. And just because it's on the cull list doesn't mean it's going to get culled. It just means it's removed from our system. So there's, yeah, kind of that next level of the decision making, which is fascinating. But I don't want to get bogged down in that. I'm going to go to Ian next, who was next in the queue, I think. Go on, Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. Just picking up basically on initially on that. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to change the system, then you need to have an animal that's appropriate for that system, and it surely has to be poor animal welfare to try and force an animal that isn't appropriate for the system that you're using into that system. The point I just wanted to ask Siobhan was, looking at this, what's our baseline in terms of what we're comparing the animal welfare, how we're comparing the animal welfare? Is there an argument that the fundamental baseline should be the welfare of an equivalent animal in the wild? And I'm not quite sure what I think about the whole debates around animal welfare, because there are some extreme people in the vegan movement who are now arguing that we should actually turn wild animals away from being carnivorous by genetic modification and things like that, which I consider to be completely on a different planet. But you know, they're fundamentally saying that we should even be altering the welfare angle on wild animals. Fundamentally, we're talking, particularly with being pasture for life here, we're talking about herbivores, and my absolute rock bottom baseline comparison would be to the life standard of wild herbivores.
Yes. Well, this is such an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, I guess we tend to hold ourselves to something a bit higher than the wild because, you know, after all, it's kind of our decision to bring them into the fold and use them and so on. And so therefore we feel a kind of a greater obligation to them, and we are able to protect them from, you know, the worst, you know, starvation and predation and so on that could occur in the wild, which is really awful. I was challenged by somebody to just say off the top of my head whether wild animals on balance had good or bad welfare. Like what was it for all wild animals in the world? Like is it overall good or is it overall bad? And I honestly, it was such a hard question, but I mean my overall, I think it was probably my natural optimism that was driving me to say, oh, it must be good, surely. And then I really started thinking about how many animals there are, and of course, you know, how they might die and all the rest of it. But this person was really convinced that actually it was overall negative. And so that obviously does, you know, would skew you definitely to thinking how we might compare them. So I think we, you know, to come back to your idea of the baseline, I think the wild is, I don't know, it feels too low to me. So I think like we've got to go up, we've got to go above that. But yeah, I think it's easier probably to let the animals tell us like how they, like what they want, and you know, the choices that they would make, and then for us to try and provide them, I suppose, is, you know, maybe easier rather than to think about that we need a direct comparator.
I certainly agree that we should be aiming for the best we can achieve. The question mark is around what is the best we can achieve, and that will be an individual decision for each producer.
Yeah.
But my starting point is that for all but the very worst production systems, and we do see some of those sadly, the life of a domesticated herbivore is, on the whole, substantially better than the life of a wild herbivore. I certainly wouldn't want to be a wild herbivore myself.
Would you say that's true for intensive dairy as well?
Yeah, I struggle with intensive dairy. I really do. I struggle with intensive pigs and poultry as well. You know, I was horrified the first time I went into the intensive pig buildings at Harper when I did my HND many years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was a suckler beef producer, so it was fairly close to a natural system.
Yeah.
And I would like to think that towards the end of my career, because we sold the farm last year, my cattle were having a much better quality of life than they were earlier in my career. That was something that I was striving for.
Yeah.
But that was about what worked for them and what they really appreciated.
Yeah. And I see Charlotte's put some info in the chat for us, which is interesting to reflect on, like disease, injury, and starvation, so on in the wild.
Yeah, and if you're ever interested, there's a very interesting Instagram account called Nature is Metal, and it just kind of really highlights that nature is red in tooth and claw, as it were. And yeah, sometimes it's a useful reminder. And it's interesting, actually, Siobhan, the question about the baseline, because one could argue that 100% pasture-fed systems are way closer in comparison to wild animals than they are to our more intensive farming counterparts. So I think it depends on where your system is on the spectrum as to what the baseline you're comparing against, because it wouldn't make sense for us to compare against something that is much more controlled, I would imagine. Pen, we're going to come back to you, and also I'm conscious of time, so we need to be quick with our questions.
Quick.
Sorry,
there's two separate things. One was following a bit from that, was just to say earlier this week I was at a stakeholder workshop for Natural England discussing rewilding and the health implications of that, and how much hands-on and input the people in a rewilding situation should have in the welfare. What they'll decide at the end of that is something else. But the other thing I wanted to ask you, Siobhan, and maybe the other people of welfare people, is what do you think about the mob grazing and this pushing the animals quite close together in terms of their welfare and their welfare status? Because it's often said that the electric fencing is acting as the predator, which is that stressful situation, pushing them closer together. Or is it because you're moving them regularly and giving them food, and the animals resign themselves to being in that situation, that they are having good welfare? Or how do you come to that decision? Because it's something I think a lot of people just take for granted, that they're being given them good welfare, and I'm not always so certain they are.
That's a really interesting question, Pen. I actually don't know. I don't know the research on this at all, so I'd be really happy to hear others' views on it. I mean, I've seen it in practice, obviously on other farms, and as it's described, it's supposed to be like the wildebeest or something, isn't it? Kind of, But honestly, I don't know whether there's any sense of predation or whatever from the electric, but yeah, happy to hear other views.
should we carry on with the questions? Then if we've got time, we can maybe come back to views on that. I think there's a few of us in the group who are grazing in that way, so it might be useful to share thoughts. Let's go to Catherine.
Well, starting with that point, actually, now that it's come up, I'm not a fan of mob grazing. At the moment we're trying to operate a rotational system, but I like the idea that our cattle have space and they can wander about and choose where they go at different times of the day. They can hang out with their friends. They can keep away from the ones they don't like, and that is the case. They have there's members of the group that they don't necessarily get on with. So I think that allows them to exhibit much more natural behaviour than squishing them up behind an electric fence. Anyway, my question was, do you think we run the risk of anthropomorphizing is that the right word? Particularly at higher welfare levels. Our cattle all out winter, and on a wet and cold and windy day, you quite likely find them in a little huddle behind a wall, heads down. Now, I think, oh, they look a bit miserable, but that's me relating to how I would feel if I was standing out in that weather. They might be fine. So are we at risk of transferring our reactions and our feelings onto them? How do we actually assess what they really feel about it?
I think that's a really good question. I think this whole thing about anthropomorphizing, it's kind of you know, it's like a bad word in animal welfare science, but in the end of the day, A, we're mammals, and B, we're amazingly attuned to kind of looking at body language of other animals that we've been involved with for some time. So I think we can tell some things, but I guess my question to you comes back again about your cows. I'm guessing they don't only look miserable to you because you think I would be miserable if I was there. I'm guessing there's something about their posture and other things that are saying that. And would they choose something else? Like if you offered them, you know, more shelter from the wind other than the wall or whatever, and a different temperature and a different environment, would they choose that? And I guess that's one way of asking the animals, isn't it, to tell us?
Yes, and quite possibly they would. I mean, they're clearly looking for shelter and making use of what's available to them in the field, to shelter from the weather as best they can. I mean, interestingly, we've got a bull and a cow who have got access to the shed. They can come and go as they please. And it's interesting because they spend more time in the shed than I thought they would. That is where we're giving them hay to eat because it's easier to do it like that. But actually, that very sensibly, when it's wet and windy, they come inside, and they seem quite happy with that. So
interesting.
Maybe that answers my question.
Sarah, you've been super patient. Should we come to you for your question?
Yeah, I feel naughty, Siobhan, because I could ask you this another time, but it might be interesting to everybody. So this is as a farmer, probably more than thinking about animal welfare from a research perspective, but quite this idea of choose to choose and looking at that photograph of the very fat dog and thinking about our cows. They're a new herd brought onto the farm in the last 3 years, and they came from Dumfries, quite rough grazing. When we went and we selected them, they were really going for looking after themselves as best they could. We bring them back to our farm, and we happen to have quite good grassland and some less favourable but much more diverse grassland, triple SI. These cows literally sulk when they go in the triple SI, and they stand at the gate and they say, Sarah, I cannot eat this. Literally, it's just too hard work and it's not as delicious. And it's that idea around choose to choose. Is there this idea that actually they sometimes, just like humans, just make the wrong choice for themselves? And is that a farmer playing the parent role of kind of like, no, you will eat your greens, and I was just interested in your views on it as to actually animals just like the fat dog, the fat dog's fed too much by the humans, but this is kind of the alternative of actually you're a native cow, you're quite capable of thriving off this land, off you go.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And you know, we have to step in because that, you know, that evolution has driven them. So you've shown them the stuff that's like evolutionarily desirable because it's easy. They don't have to expend much energy to get, you know, the food and the nutrients out of it and so on. But if it's going to be ultimately bad for them, then yeah, we have got to be the parent and yeah, make sure that they're protected from it. Yeah, they definitely. I like your you know, your story about them. I mean, they are telling you what they want, aren't they?
I've heard that about,
Yeah,
or some people talk about mob grazing, that they can force animals to eat things that they wouldn't choose to eat, because they, as part of the mob grazing, they have to eat what's there. So that's making them eat their greens, I guess.
I feel like Sarah, our herd matriarch Georgia, and your cows came from the same place. I'm sure they didn't, but she very much sulks if there's not lush green stuff in front of her these days. John, we need to be quick because we've got 7 minutes left and we need to finish on time. Sorry.
Quick. We've focused on a good life, and I'd just like to focus on the good death, because in a sense there's some feedback that if you want to give an animal a good death, this is sort of feedback into the welfare. And this came about when 4 or 5 years ago, someone came on the forum saying, I'm taking an animal to slaughter for the first time. And how do I manage this process? I feel very uneasy. And there was an outpouring of ideas from farmers about how to cope with this. I won't go through this. And that's one of the things that motivated me to put together this thing called Saying Farewell, which I sent to you last night, Siobhan, and circulated again today. You said you're quite happy just to maybe just touch on it. And so I just wondered if you got any comments on that, because you did say that one of the farmers that you're friends with is wrestling with this topic at the moment. Thanks.
I did, that's right, and I have sent it on to them. And yeah, I think it's really, it is such a difficult thing because, it's that to be a custodian for so long and to be a caregiver and so on, and then obviously to take away that life is, it is really difficult. But one thing I am sure of is that it surely must be made easier if you feel like you've given a good life while the animal is here. So I think that's something, and something that I noticed really early on as a vet in practice, thinking about companion animal work that I did. People always cried more at the death of their animals when they felt guilty. If it was the right time and they brought the animal timely way, of course, they're upset and whatever. But yeah, that level of kind of guilt, I think, is, it really plays on people. So at least, being able to avoid that through a good life is positive. And it's no bad thing to always be respectful and thankful of the animals that we have and the time that they're here. And whilst recognizing that they have no choice at all, I think it's really important to remember that they're entirely brought here by us. Then that just adds to our responsibility, I guess.
Thank you.
Charlotte.
Hi, yeah, so I guess my question is sort of for everyone, and it's under the concept of like the social lives of these animals and how disruptive our kind of systems where we're bringing animals out of the herd constantly, especially if you have smaller groups, like if you have a micro dairy of say 3 cows and they might have their yearlings and their calves, and there's very little continuity. It's not really specific, but I just wonder if anyone has really thought about that issue and how we can manage that, because there's also I guess there's very little you can do to manage the fact that some animals are always going to be kind of ostracized or lower in the pecking order. But I don't know if that's something that we have any capacity to address, or at least just consider in how we manage livestock. If we're like there, we have a constant turnover, I guess.
I'm happy to comment a bit, but very happy to hear other views. It's obviously we know that those social relationships in our social animals are really important, and there are lots of things that we can do to buffer those difficult social times. So we know that enrichment is really helpful in that any type of kind of social stress. So even just really simple food enrichments or something has been shown in many studies to have an ameliorating effect. So I think there's lots of things that we can do to buffer those times, which I'm sure people are doing practically, as well as being shown in the research as well. But then you were talking about a kind of a system issue as well, and obviously some of our systems. I mean, even just thinking about the vet school farm at Bristol, where almost any dairy farm, cows are going back and forth all the time between high and low yielding groups and all the rest of it. So there's always a kind of there's things that are built into the system, and it's really difficult.
Charlotte, I know you asked that more openly to the group, but I'm going to come to Maria just to make sure she has time to ask her question before we finish up. But that might be something we want to pick up via an email discussion later on, Charlotte, if you want to type the question out maybe and share. Maria.
Actually, it's more of a comment on what John was saying, that I think it's the worst day every day that I have to take them to slaughter, and it would be really interesting to have that discussion in greater detail. The only way that I have sort of steeled myself is to go with them, and because we still can take them to a small slaughterhouse, I know when they clock in, and because I ask for my offal, I know when I get it in my hands. So normally that's half an hour, and that's sort of my way of protecting myself from that question of what is their death like. And it would be really interesting to hear what others have to say about that too. I know we don't have much time left, but I just leave that as.
Can I ask you a question, Maria? How much would that? How much would it change if the animals could be killed on the farm? Is the journey and whatever been there? Is it more about the death of those individuals that's problematic for you?
No. I mean, it would be a hugely beneficial thing if we could kill them on the farm. Absolutely. I think we would all say the same. I can't see anybody not saying that.
And obviously with the reduction in abattoirs, the distance that people are having to drive to get to one, either their local one or one that they rate, increases all the time. And so it's not, that ability to on-farm slaughter. There is, just to make a note, some really interesting work happening in Orkney at the moment where they're looking at putting back an abattoir, but actually there are a collection of farmers who are saying, let's just not bother with that, let's instead push for on-farm slaughter, which would be a much more useful approach. So it'd be really interesting to see how that develops as a case study. I'm going to close up the session there because we're at risk of then carrying on into another very interesting tangent, I'm sure. I'm so grateful, Siobhan, for you coming to speak, and I'm delighted that you and Lizzie are hopefully going to be joining us on a panel at Groundswell if we get the go ahead for that. And I think that a lot of the discussion today will be really relevant within that session. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. Thanks everyone for coming along. It's been absolutely fascinating, and yeah, we really hope that we can find ways to work with you even more in the future, and particularly thinking about how we can use the Good Life framework to assess pasture for life farms. I think that's something that Jenna, when she's back off her maternity leave, is really keen to kickstart again. So we'll probably be in touch with Lizzie at that point. Right. But thank you. Thanks ever so much.
Lovely. Thank you for being here. Yes.
Take care. Enjoy your weekend, everybody, when it comes. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Siobhan.
Thanks.